Humans can recognize us by our faces?
I've got you.
Just follow my hand. I feel you.
Dr. Tavira Sen had spent 11 years cataloging the ways humans failed to perceive the world correctly, and she had never once doubted the premise until the day Nolan said her name from across a crowded corridor without turning to look at her badge. She was an orange and white Vulpine, tall even among her own kind, with bright green eyes that her research colleagues liked to joke could read a data terminal from across a room. She worked in the Xenosensory division aboard Meridian Coil, a research station built into the hollowed spine of an asteroid too large to be called small and too irregular to be called a moon, where 7 interstellar cultures maintained a fragile, curious peace in the name of shared science. Vulpines made up the majority of the station's population, and among Vulpines, scent was not a sense. It was a language. It was memory made physical, carried on the air in molecules that told you who someone was, how they were feeling, whether they had been injured recently, whether they had eaten well, whether they were lying. Faces, by comparison, were considered almost useless. Fur patterns repeated across bloodlines. Expressions shifted with mood and lighting. 2 unrelated Vulpines from opposite ends of the same continent could look near identical and smell like entirely different histories. It was scent that anchored identity. It was scent that Vulpines used to recognize their children in a crowd, their bonded partners in the dark, their dead at a memorial when only ash remained of the face. Humans, everyone assumed, must live in a fog of near blindness by comparison. Their noses were vestigial jokes, capable of detecting little beyond spoiled food and open flame. Tavira had built the early framework of her research career on precisely that assumption. That human social cognition aboard mixed-species stations must be a patchwork of guesswork, name tags, and voice recognition, propped up by technology because biology had failed them. Then the systems division transferred a new specialist to her wing, and the assumption did not survive first contact. Nolan was unremarkable in the ways that Vulpines usually noticed first. He did not carry himself with any particular sense signature of authority or lineage, because of course he had none of the markers Vulpines read instinctively. He was of middling human height, dark-haired, quiet in his movements, the kind of person who fixed conduit relays and diagnostic arrays without announcing that he had done it. Tavira was paired with him on a 6-month cross-disciplinary study, human sensory limitation as it pertained to station security protocols. It was, on paper, meant to be simple. She would document his deficiencies. He would help her understand which technological aids compensated for them. On the 2nd day of the assignment, she changed into a fresh uniform between shifts, replaced her identification badge with a temporary maintenance pass, and approached him from downwind in a corridor thick with the ozone stink of a recently serviced coolant line, conditions under which she was certain no scent trail could survive. "Good morning, Dr. Sen," Nolan said, without looking up from the panel he was recalibrating. She stopped walking. "How did you know it was me?" He glanced over, mildly puzzled by the question, the way a person is puzzled by being asked how they know their own hand from someone else's. "I looked at you." "You did not look at me. Your back was turned. I saw your reflection in the panel glass." He said it simply, the way one might explain that water was wet, and returned to his work. Tavira stood there a moment longer than the conversation required, turning the answer over as if it might yield a hidden mechanism if she examined it long enough. It did not. It was, infuriatingly, exactly what he had said it was. He had looked at a distorted, half-lit reflection in polished glass and known her. She logged the incident in her notes, that evening under a heading she would later delete and rewrite 4 times. Anomalous recognition. Possible tracking device. Investigate. She did not, in fact, believe he was tracking her, not really, not after the first week, when she had quietly run a scan of his personal effects during a routine equipment audit and found nothing beyond a data slate, a photograph of a dog long dead, and a set of tools worn smooth with use. But she needed the belief to hold a little longer, because the alternative explanation unsettled her more than she wanted to admit to her research log. The alternative was that Nolan Vey simply looked at things, and remembered what he saw, in a way no Vulpine she had ever met bothered to do, because no Vulpine had ever needed to. Over the following weeks, working alongside him in the cramped sensory lab that smelled permanently of solder and recycled air, she began compiling smaller, quieter proofs. He greeted her correctly through the mirrored visor of an isolation suit that fully masked her scent and silhouette both, at a distance where her identification implant should have been shielded. He recognized her voice through vocal distortion filters that even her own sister struggled to place. Once, in the mess hall, she deliberately sat 2 tables behind him, downwind, wearing another researcher's borrowed jacket, and he turned around within 90 seconds and asked why she was hiding. "I am not hiding," she said. "I am testing a hypothesis. Which is that you are either an exceptionally gifted liar, or human vision is not the crude instrument my species assumes it to be." Nolan considered this with the same unhurried patience he brought to a malfunctioning relay. "Could be both," he said. "I'm a decent liar. But not about this." "Then explain it to me." "Precisely. Not I looked at you. What did you see?" He studied her for a long moment. Longer than was strictly comfortable, though she did not look away, because looking away would have meant losing a point in whatever contest this had quietly become between them. "The shape of your eyes," he said finally. "They tilt up a little more on the left than the right. There's a mark under your left cheek, small, lighter than the rest of your fur. You probably don't even think about it. Your right ear tips forward when you're concentrating on something you find difficult, and it doesn't do that when the problem is easy for you. And you hold your hands behind your back when you're nervous about something you're not going to admit to being nervous about." He paused. "You're doing it right now." Tavira's hands, which had been clasped loosely behind her back without her notice, went suddenly, deliberately still. No one had ever catalogued her that way. Not her research supervisors, not her littermates, not even Ressa, the partner she had shared a den with for 4 years before their bond quietly dissolved into friendship and separate postings. Ressa had known her by the layered chemistry of her, by the specific note of home scent that meant Tavira is safe, Tavira is close, Tavira is mine. No one had ever looked at the actual architecture of her face and found something worth memorizing there. She went back to her quarters that night and stood in front of the small mirror above her wash basin for a long time, tilting her head, trying to see what he had described. The asymmetry in her eyes. The pale mark beneath her cheek that she had genuinely never noticed in 29 years of looking at this face, and assuming there was nothing in it worth looking at. She found the mark. It took her 4 minutes. She told herself the personnel file was a professional necessity. A researcher ought to understand her research subject's history, his prior postings, the shape of the life that had produced whatever unusual cognitive habit she was now attempting to document. That was the justification she offered her own conscience when she pulled Nolan Vey's service record from the Correlate archive on a quiet evening shift, and it was, she knew even as she read it, only half true. The record was sparse in the way human records often were, thin next to the dense generational archives Vulpines kept on every member of a den going back 6 generations. Nolan Vey, born on a colony world called Aldrin's Reach, 3 older siblings, no listed bonded partner, no listed offspring. A string of postings across the interspecies correlates outer stations. Systems maintenance, always somewhere small and unglamorous, never the flagship postings that ambitious young specialists usually angled for. He had requested the transfer to Meridian Coil himself, 6 months prior, for reasons the record did not specify. She asked him about it directly the next day, because she had never learned the art of asking about a thing sideways, and did not particularly want to learn it now. "Why here?" she said, setting 2 cups of the bitter recycled tea the lab kept in permanent supply between them. "Your record shows you turned down a posting on a research flagship with triple the pay to come to a mid-sized correlate station instead. That is not an ambitious move. Nolan turned his cup slowly between his hands, not drinking. My dog died the week before the flagship offer came through, he said. 14 years old. I'd had him since I was a kid on Aldrin's Reach, dragged him across 4 postings, and then he just wasn't there anymore, and I was in temporary quarters on a station with 11,000 strangers, and it occurred to me that I'd spent a long time being very good at fixing systems and not very good at being known by anybody. He shrugged, a small, self-deprecating motion. Meridian Coil had an opening in a division that studied how species recognize each other. Seemed like as good a place as any to figure out why I'd gotten so bad at it. Tavira had not expected an answer with that much weight in it, and found she did not know, for a moment, what to do with the weight once it had been handed to her. "I'm sorry," she said. "About the dog." "Yeah." He looked down at the tea. He used to know me from across a field before I'd even called his name. Just the way I walked, I guess. I used to think that was just a dog thing. Loyalty, or instinct, or whatever people call it when they don't want to think too hard about it. He glanced up at her, and there was something unguarded in it that she filed away instantly, without meaning to, in the same private archive where she was keeping the mark beneath her own cheek. Turns out it might just be a looking thing. Turns out maybe I do it too, if I look long enough at the right person. Tavira did not have a scientific response prepared for that, and for once did not reach for one. The idea for the exchange experiment came to her 3 weeks later, during the run-up to the Lantern Drift. An old Vulpine cultural festival, brought to Meridian Coil by the station's large diaspora population and now celebrated by nearly everyone regardless of species, because it involved good food, good music, and an excuse to fill the central concourse with drifting paper lanterns lit from within by bioluminescent gel. It was, Tavira realized while reviewing the festival schedule, the perfect experimental environment. Nearly 200 Vulpines would gather in the central exchange. The air would be thick with perfumed oils, roasting spice bark, ceremonial incense burned in numbers large enough to overwhelm any scent trail, human or Vulpine. People would wear festival robes that obscured body shape. It was, in short, exactly the kind of sensory chaos that should defeat him. "I want to run a controlled test," she told him, laying out the parameters with the crisp formality she used to disguise how much she wanted this particular hypothesis disproven. "During the drift, I will remove all identification. I will alter my scent with masking oil. I will wear unfamiliar robes and stand among 200 people who look, to any human eye, essentially identical to one another. You will have 1 hour to find me. And if I can't, then we will have established a genuine limit to human sensory recognition, which will strengthen the paper considerably." She did not add the second half of that thought, which was, "And I will be able to stop thinking about how you looked at my face like it was worth memorizing." "And if I can?" Tavira did not have a prepared answer for that, which annoyed her more than the question deserved. The night of the drift, she stood at the edge of the crowded exchange in unfamiliar amber robes, her scent buried under 3 layers of masking oil, her badges left behind in her quarters, watching lanterns rise past the high transparent dome toward the black scatter of stars beyond. Around her, the festival moved in its slow golden current, laughter, drumbeats, the sweet char of roasting spice bark, incense thick enough to taste. Vendors called out over the noise. Children in bright ceremonial pink chased each other between the legs of adults twice their height, and somewhere near the center of the concourse a trio of string players kept up a rhythm old enough that even the human staff on shift had learned to tap their feet to it without knowing why. She let herself be folded into the crowd the way a single grain of sand disappears into a shore, and she told herself, with the calm certainty of a scientist protecting a hypothesis, that this time he would fail. Nolan entered the exchange 9 minutes after the hour began. She watched him from across the concourse, half hidden behind a cluster of lantern vendors, and permitted herself a small, private satisfaction at how lost he looked. Turning, scanning, a human alone in a sea of orange and cream and russet fur, robes, and unfamiliar faces. He stopped scanning after perhaps 40 seconds. He walked directly toward her. Not toward the general area. Not toward a cluster of likely candidates. Toward her, weaving unhurried through the crowd with the same quiet economy of motion he brought to fixing a relay, and he stopped in front of her with an expression that was not triumphant, only mildly pleased, the way a person is pleased to find a friend at a gathering. "You cheated," Tavira said before she could stop herself. "I didn't. You could not have, there is no possible." She stopped, made herself breathe, made herself ask the question properly, the way a scientist should. "How?" He looked at her for a moment, and something in his expression shifted, softened, the way it did sometimes in the lab when he'd solved a problem he'd been quietly enjoying. "The eyes?" he said. "The mark under your cheek. The way your left ear does that thing when you're trying not to look nervous." He nodded slightly at her hands, which had drifted, without her permission, behind her back again. "And that? You do that a lot around me." Tavira became aware, distantly, that the noise of the festival had receded into something background and unimportant, the way sound does when a person is concentrating on something that actually matters. "No one has ever found me that way," she said. "Not without scent. Not even my own family." "Doesn't mean it can't be done," Nolan said. "Just means nobody's looked." She could not let it go after that. It was not, she told herself, a personal fascination, it was scientific rigor. A single successful trial did not constitute proof. She needed replication, control conditions, statistical confidence. She needed, above all, to understand the mechanism, because a Vulpine scientist did not accept, "I looked," as an adequate explanation for anything. So she designed harder tests. She stood behind reinforced glass thick enough to distort color and shape, in a security observation bay usually reserved for quarantine monitoring, and had him identify her among 4 other orange-marked Vulpines standing in identical postures. He found her in under a minute, citing the tilt of her head and what he called the particular way you hold stillness, like you're pretending to be relaxed. She appeared on distorted camera feeds piped through 3 compression algorithms designed to strip identifying detail from station security footage, feeds so degraded that even Vulpine facial pattern software failed to differentiate individuals with confidence above 60%. He picked her out at a glance, every time, and when she demanded to know how, he said something about the particular rhythm of how she moved. "You walk like you're already 3 steps ahead of whatever's happening, even when you're just crossing a room," that made her feel, unaccountably, examined down to some private structural level she had not known was visible. She organized the trial with an entire research cohort wearing identical ceremonial masks that covered everything but the eyes, standing in a group of 12, silent, in a dim corridor. He found her in 11 seconds. When pressed. Because by now pressing him had become less an experimental necessity, and more a habit she indulged in for reasons she declined to examine, he said only, "Your eyes do something none of the others do. I don't have better words for it than that." Somewhere in the accumulation of these trials, something changed in the character of her note-taking. Her early logs had been clinical, subject correctly identified target at range of 4.2 meters under low-light conditions. By the 6th week, her entries had begun to include things a proper research log had no need of. He noticed I'd cut my hair tie differently before I'd consciously registered doing it myself. Query: is this level of attentiveness typical of the species, or specific to the subject? Second query, unaddressed in current methodology: does it matter which? She began, without deciding to, learning him the same way. Not through scent. That channel remained closed to her, human biochemistry too faint and strange for her nose to parse with any confidence, but through the same currency he seemed to trade in. The uneven lift at the left corner of his mouth when something amused him, and he was trying not to show it. The small crease that appeared between his eyebrows exactly when a problem in front of him resisted an easy solution, and the way it smoothed the instant he found one. The particular quiet that settled into his expression, not blank, but soft, unguarded, in the moments he thought she wasn't looking, whenever she was in the room with him and doing nothing more remarkable than existing. She noticed that quiet the most. She catalogued it the most carefully, and told herself it was for the research. It was Nolan, in the end, who first admitted to doubting the thing they had built between them, and he did it on an ordinary evening that gave no warning of the conversation it was about to become. They had stayed late in the lab, ostensibly to finish calibrating the equipment for the next trial, though the calibration had been finished for the better part of an hour, and neither of them had moved to leave. Tavira was cataloging data on a slate she was not really reading. Nolan sat across the bench from her, turning a small hand tool over and over between his fingers, the way he did when something other than the tool was occupying his attention. "Can I ask you something?" he said finally. "That isn't about the research." "You may." "What happens to this?" He gestured, a small, uncertain motion that took in the lab, the data slate, the space between them. "When the study ends?" 6 months was the original scope. We're most of the way through it. Dre's going to want a final report, and after that, I go back to being a systems specialist with an ordinary posting, and you go back to being a xenobiologist with a very interesting paper to her name. And I don't know what I am to you once there's no experiment left to justify the two of us spending every evening in the same room. Tavira set the data slate down. She had not, she realized, actually considered the end of the study as a real boundary. Had let the research extend itself in her mind indefinitely, the way a person avoids looking directly at a deadline they are afraid of. "You are asking whether I have only tolerated your company because it served my methodology. I'm asking whether I've been kidding myself," Nolan said more quietly. "Whether the version of you I've been learning is a person, or whether some of it's just professional proximity, dressed up as something warmer, because we spend a lot of hours in small rooms together, and it's easy to mistake that for closeness." It was, Tavira thought, a fair question, and a braver one than most Vulpine courtship customs would have required either of them to ask aloud this early. Her culture built slow architectures around exactly this kind of uncertainty. Long courtship periods, formal choosing rituals, careful public gestures that let two people test the weight of a bond before either had to say the word plainly. Humans, it seemed, sometimes simply asked. "I have built my entire career," she said, "on the belief that identity could be reduced to measurable signal. Scent markers. Chemical trace. Things a machine could quantify with more precision than any living knows. I did not choose you as a research subject because you were convenient, Nolan. I chose the study because you were an anomaly I could not explain, and I have spent 2 months discovering that the explanation is not a mechanism I can publish in a table of results." She met his eyes steady. "It is that I look forward to the hours in this lab more than I look forward to almost anything else in my working life, and it is not because of what the hours produce for my methodology. It is because of what they produce in me." Nolan set the tool down at last, some of the careful tension going out of his shoulders. "That's not a scientist's answer." "No," Tavira agreed. "It is not." She reached across the bench, not quite touching him, close enough that the space between their hands became its own small, deliberate statement. "When the study ends, I do not intend for this to end with it. I would like that stated plainly, in whatever manner your customs require, so that neither of us spends another evening wondering whether the other only stayed for the research." "My customs?" Nolan said, something warm breaking through the careful uncertainty in his voice. "Don't really have a formal manner for this. We mostly just keep showing up." "Then keep showing up," Tavira said. "I find I have grown rather fond of that particular custom." Not everyone in the Xenosensory division found the accumulating results interesting. Dr. Rennick Fal, senior researcher in the adjacent Technology lab and, by the unspoken math of a small research wing, the colleague most often mentioned in the same breath as Tavira by anyone speculating about her eventual bonding, made his skepticism a matter of public record at the division's monthly review. "With respect," Rennick said, addressing the review panel rather than Tavira directly, which she had learned over the years was his preferred method of insult. "What Dr. Sen is calling a discovery, I would call a very elaborate parlor trick performed by a subject with an obvious personal incentive to keep performing well for her. His tail moved in the slow, deliberate arc that meant he considered himself entirely reasonable. No one disputes that the human is unusually observant. What is being smuggled into the literature, under cover of that observation, is a claim that visual cognition rivals scent bonding as a mechanism of identity. That is not merely an academic overreach. It undermines 40 years of security doctrine on this station, doctrine my own division has spent considerable resources refining. Your division, Tavira said, keeping her voice level, refines scent-masking compounds whose entire purpose is to defeat the sensory system you are now defending as infallible. I would think you, of anyone in this room, would understand how easily that system can be fooled. Which is precisely why we take such care to control its use, Rennick said. Unlike your experiments, which appear to have no containment protocol at all beyond your own enthusiasm. The remark drew a thin ripple of laughter from two junior researchers near the back of the room, and Tavira felt her ears flatten before she could stop them, a betrayal of composure she corrected a half-second too late for anyone paying attention to miss. Nolan, seated beside her, said nothing during the exchange. It was not his place, as a visiting specialist, to argue correlate politics in a review he had only been invited to observe. But she noticed, afterward, that he had watched Rennick with the same close, cataloging attention he gave to everything, and when she asked him about it later he only said, "Man's not wrong that there's a personal incentive in this room. He's just wrong about whose." It was the closest either of them came, for several more weeks, to naming the thing directly. Administrator Kessadre, who oversaw the station's interspecies research correlate and controlled the funding allocations for every cross-disciplinary study running through the wing, called Tavira into her office the day after the review, with an expression that suggested this would not be a pleasant conversation. Your reports, Dre said, sliding a data slate across the desk with two claws, have stopped reading like science. Tavira kept her ears level with some effort. The data is rigorous. Every trial is documented, controlled, and repeatable. The data is rigorous. Your commentary is not. Dre's tail flicked once sharp. You are proposing, in your most recent summary, that human facial cognition may represent an entire unexplored sensory framework equivalent in depth to Vulpine olfactory bonding. That is not a modest claim, Doctor. That is a claim that unsettles a great many assumptions this station's entire security architecture is built on. Assumptions about what humans can and cannot perceive, assumptions your predecessors spent decades establishing. Dr. Fowl raised a formal complaint after yesterday's review. He is not the only one who raised it. Then perhaps my predecessors were wrong. Perhaps, Dre said in a tone that made clear she did not believe it. Your judgment on this particular subject has become compromised. Tavira went still in the specific, controlled way she went still when she was furious and unwilling to show it. Explain that accusation. You spend considerable time with the human specialist. More than the study strictly requires, according to the duty logs. There are members of this correlate who wonder whether Nolan Vey's uncanny accuracy is less a discovery about human perception and more a discovery about how thoroughly a research subject can influence his own researcher. Dre's green eyes, paler than Tavira's, colder, held steady. There is also the matter of the tracking device inquiry you filed in your first week, which you never formally closed. If you suspect this man of covertly monitoring your movements, that is a security matter, not a romance. I would ask you to decide cleanly which story you are telling me, because right now you appear to be telling both. The words landed harder than Tavira wanted to admit. She had filed that first inquiry in a fit of suspicion so many weeks ago it felt like it belonged to a different, smaller version of herself, one who had not yet stood in a crowd of 200 people and been found in under a minute by a man with nothing but his own eyes to guide him. There is no device, Tavira said. I confirmed that in the second week and should have formally closed the file. I will do so today. As for the rest, she made herself hold Dre's gaze. The data stands regardless of my personal feelings about the subject. If you doubt my objectivity, assign an independent observer to the next trial. I welcomed the scrutiny. Dre studied her for a long moment, tail still, considering. I will do exactly that, she said finally. One trial. Fully independent conditions, designed by my office, not yours. If the human passes it under those terms, I will fund the continuation of your study myself, publicly, and stop the whispers in this correlate that you've built a research paper around an infatuation. A pause. And if he fails, Dr. Sen, you will write the retraction yourself, and you will do it honestly. The independent trial Dre's office designed was, by any reasonable measure, cruel. Nolan would be given no advance notice of the conditions. He would enter the central atrium at an unscheduled hour, among a crowd of Vulpine station staff going about ordinary business. No festival, no masking oils to explain away a failure, no controlled lighting. Somewhere in that crowd, at a location he would not be told, Tavira would be standing in an environmental hazard suit, full coverage, mirrored visor, the same model worn by every technician on the station, indistinguishable from a dozen others who would be seated through the atrium at Dre's instructions specifically to confound him. No face. No fur. No visible scent, no visible gait beyond the suit's own stiff mechanics. Nothing that had worked before would be available to him now. Tavira stood inside the suit, breathing the recycled air through the small filtration hiss, watching the atrium through a mirrored visor that let her see out without anyone seeing in, and felt something she was reluctant to name as nerves. Dre stood at the observation rail with two members of the correlate board, Rennick Fowl among them, arms folded, his expression carefully neutral in the way that meant he expected vindication rather than surprise. 12 identical suits moved through the crowd on staggered patterns, some pausing at terminals, some walking in loose loops, engineered to give a searching eye as little to work with as possible. Nolan entered on schedule. He did not rush. He stood for a moment near the atrium's entrance, and Tavira watched him take in the space the way he took in a malfunctioning system, quietly, methodically, without panic. Her chest did something complicated and unscientific. He crossed the atrium slowly. He passed the first suited figure without slowing. He passed the second and third the same way. At the fourth, he paused, only for a second, some small detail catching and then releasing his attention, and moved on. Tavira, standing near a support column with her hands clasped, thoroughly, deliberately, behind her back, watched him narrow the crowd the way a person narrows a search when they are not guessing but remembering, cross-referencing something too fine-grained to name against a dozen candidates that all, to every observer at that rail, looked precisely the same. He stopped in front of her within 4 minutes. "That's a new record for difficulty," he said. "Even for you." "How?" Tavira said, and this time the word came out without any of the clinical distance she usually wrapped around it. "There is nothing left to see. No face. No fur. No scent. I am wearing exactly the same suit as 11 other people. You're standing with your weight on your left foot, the way you do when you think no one's watching and you're trying to look calm anyway." His voice, muffled slightly by the suit's external speaker but unmistakably his own patient cadence, carried across the small distance between them. "And you turned toward me about half a second before I turned toward you. Everyone else in this room reacted to me walking past. You reacted before I got there." At the observation rail, Dre said nothing for a long moment, and then, quietly, to the board member beside her, "Fund it." Beside her, Rennick Fowl's tail had gone very still, and he did not, this time, offer an objection. That night, in the small common room attached to the sensory lab, Tavira told him the story her grandmother had told her as a kid, back on the green terraced hills of her family's homeworld, long before either of them had ever imagined a station like Meridian Coil. "There is an old belief," she said, turning a data slate over in her hands without reading it. "Older than most of the correlates that govern us now, from before scent marking implants, from before any of the technology we use to formalize a bond. It says that true bonded partners, not just den mates, not just companions, but bonded, in the old sense, could recognize one another even after death. Even when the body had gone to ash and there was no scent left in the universe to carry. The story says the bond itself becomes a kind of sense. That you learn a person so completely you would know them by nothing at all, if nothing at all was what remained. That's a nice story, Nolan said carefully, for whoever your grandmother was trying to comfort. I used to think it was a story for the grieving, Tavira admitted. A kindness invented to soften loss. My whole professional life has been built on the assumption that identity is chemical, that recognition is a function of what the nose can hold, and that anything else is metaphor. She looked at him, and did not look away. I do not think it is only metaphor anymore. Nolan was quiet for a moment. When he spoke, his voice had lost some of its usual careful lightness. I never had a word for what I do, Tavira. I just look at people, really look, I mean, past the first impression. And I remember what I see, and somewhere along the way the remembering turns into something closer to knowing. It's not a trick. I wish I could tell you it was a trick, something I could teach anyone who wanted the shortcut. It's just. He stopped, started again. With you it happened faster than it's ever happened with anyone. That first week, I wasn't trying to prove anything. I just already knew your face better than I knew the layout of my own quarters. That is either the most unsettling thing a person has ever said to me, Tavira said, or the kindest. Could be both, he said, echoing his own earlier words back at her, and this time neither of them was talking about lying. She did not touch him that night. Vulpine courtship did not move that quickly, not without ceremony, not without the slow architecture of choosing that her culture wrapped around anything that mattered. But she let her hand rest near his on the table between them, close enough that the gap between them became its own kind of statement, and neither of them closed it, and neither of them needed to, not yet. He showed her his quarters 2 weeks later, on an evening when the station's public spaces had emptied into the hush of the artificial night cycle, and Tavira understood, walking through the door, that this was its own kind of ceremony, even if human custom had no formal name for it. The room was smaller than her own, sparer, holding little beyond the regulation furniture every specialist's quarters came fitted with, and a handful of things that were unmistakably his: a shelf of hand tools kept in obsessively neat rows, a data slate propped against the wall showing a looping still image of green hills under an unfamiliar sun, and, on the small shelf above his bunk, the photograph she had once found in his effects during that first, suspicious audit. A young man, younger than the one standing beside her now, crouched in tall grass with his arm around a large, gray-muzzled dog. Tobias, Nolan said, following her gaze. Named him after a systems instructor I hated. Seemed like a fitting joke at the time. He picked up the photograph, turned it over once in his hands the way she had seen him turn over a faulty relay, checking it for damage out of habit rather than necessity. He used to wait for me at the end of the lane when I got back from the training yards. Didn't matter what time it was, didn't matter if I'd changed clothes or gotten hurt or come back smelling like 3 other people's sweat from a training exercise. He'd just be sitting there, ears up, tail going, like there was never any question. You have spent your whole life, Tavira said slowly, surrounded by beings who recognized you effortlessly, and somehow decided that made you the one who was bad at being known. Different thing, being recognized and being known. Nolan set the photograph back on its shelf with the same careful precision he gave to everything. Tobias knew me the way instinct knows something. Simple. Total. Didn't require anything from me except showing up. People are harder. You have to actually look at them, actually stay long enough to see past whatever they're presenting you first, and most people don't bother, because it's slower than just reading a badge or trusting a first impression. He looked at her, something quietly open in his expression that she had learned, over the past weeks, to recognize as costing him something to show. I didn't used to bother either. Not until you. Tavira crossed the small distance of the room and picked up the photograph herself, studying the young man in the grass with the dog, cataloging the shape of a face she had already learned so thoroughly she could have drawn it from memory without looking at him at all. He would have liked you very much, she said of the dog, and meant something larger by it that neither of them needed spoken aloud. They did not do anything that evening that a correlate review board would have needed to note in a log. They sat together on the narrow bunk and she asked him about Aldrin's Reach, and he asked her about the green terraced hills of her grandmother's stories, and somewhere in the slow trade of small histories that had nothing to do with scent or sight or any sense either of their species had a name for, the last of the careful, clinical distance she had built her research around simply stopped mattering. The containment breach happened on an ordinary Tuesday, in the lower atmospheric processing ring, 3 decks beneath the residential wing, and it happened the way most disasters happen, quietly, mechanically, without any warning that mattered. A filtration seal on an experimental olfactory suppression compound. Developed, with grim irony, by Rennick Fowl's own team in the Scent Technology Lab, in the course of research meant to strengthen exactly the kind of security doctrine he had defended so fiercely at the monthly review, failed under a pressure spike during a routine test. The compound vented into the ring's recirculated air supply before automated containment could isolate it, and Meridian Coil's ventilation architecture, built for efficiency rather than crisis, carried it through 6 connected decks before anyone registered the alarm. The compound did not harm the body. It did something worse. For a station built the way Meridian Coil was built, it temporarily and completely destroyed the Vulpine's sense of smell. Tavira was in the sensory lab when the alert sounded, and within 90 seconds she understood the scale of what was happening, because she could no longer smell the ozone tang of the lab's own equipment, could no longer smell the specific chemical signature of her own worry sweat, could no longer smell anything at all. Around her, in the corridor outside, the sound rising was not the sound of an ordinary evacuation. It was panic of a deeper, stranger register. The sound of people who had lost, in an instant, the primary language they used to know one another. She heard it in fragments as she moved toward the affected decks against the tide of fleeing staff, a mother screaming her child's name into a crowd of identical small faces she could no longer place. A pair of den partners of 40 years standing frozen in arm's length apart, either certain, in the chaos and the absence of scent, that the other was truly who they appeared to be. A junior technician sobbing into her calm that she could not find her own littermate, who had been standing beside her not 30 seconds before the alarm and had simply vanished into a crowd of strangers that all, suddenly, smelled like nothing at all. Dre's voice cut through the general calm channel, tight with the particular strain of someone holding a crisis together by will alone. All available personnel, converge on the lower ring. We have confirmed casualties from crush injuries in the panic, non-lethal so far, but the compound shows no sign of dissipating and the affected decks are not fully evacuated. We need eyes that still work. Tavira understood, with a clarity that arrived like cold water, what that meant, and what she had spent 9 weeks learning to do. She keyed her calm. Administrator. I can identify people by sight. I have been training in exactly this for 2 months, whether either of us meant for it to be useful. There was a pause, brief and heavy. Then get down there, doctor, and start being useful. The lower ring, by the time Tavira reached it, had filled with the acrid haze of an overtaxed filtration system fighting a losing battle against smoke from a secondary electrical fire the panic had triggered near the processing core. Visibility fell to a few meters in places. The emergency lighting cast everything in flat, directionless red. Around her, Vulpines who had spent their entire lives navigating by scent stumbled through the haze, functionally blind in the way that mattered most to them, calling names into the smoke and receiving no chemical answer, only echo. Tavira worked the way Nolan had taught her to work without either of them ever calling it teaching. She looked, actually looked, the way she had learned to look at him. Past the panic-distorted faces, past the identical staff uniforms, and found the small anchoring details that scent had always made unnecessary before, a particular scar above a brow, a specific way someone favored an old knee injury when they ran, the tilt of an ear, the shape of someone's hands as they reached for a child. She found the sobbing junior technician's littermate within the first 10 minutes, the two of them near identical in every way scent had once made irrelevant to distinguish, separated only by the faint, asymmetrical scar along one's jaw that Tavira had learned, from Nolan, to look for instead of simply smelling for. She pulled 11 people through the worst of the haze toward the evacuation lift in the space of 20 minutes, matching frightened faces to the names their families were screaming, doing with her eyes what her nose had never had to learn. It was in the 22nd minute that she realized Nolan was not answering his call. She checked the last logged position on the emergency network with hands that had gone, very precisely, cold. The failing systems wing, 3 corridors deeper into the smoke than anyone without cause should have gone, exactly the sort of place a systems specialist would run toward instead of away from, because someone had to try to reroute the ventilation controls manually before the whole ring lost breathable air entirely. "Administrator," she said into the comm, already moving. "Nolan Vey is not responding. Last position, systems wing, sublevel 3. That corridor's compromised, Doctor. We've got a pressure door failing in that section. I can't authorize." "Then I am going without authorization," Tavira said, and did not wait for an answer. The smoke in the system's wing was worse, thick enough to taste, thick enough that her eyes streamed and the emergency lights blurred into smeared red halos. She could not smell him. She could not hear him over the shriek of a failing pressure door somewhere ahead, straining against a seal that had lost its structural integrity, and was venting atmosphere in a low, dangerous howl. Every sense she had ever trusted, every sense her species had built its entire architecture of love and family and belonging around, had gone dark or useless, and she pressed forward anyway, because there was one thing left that had not failed her. She looked. Through the haze, near the failing door, a shape resolved that was not quite the shape of the emergency conduit housing beside it, a particular posture, shoulders set at a particular angle, one that she had catalogued without meaning to across 9 weeks of watching him bend over failing systems with exactly that patient, stubborn set to his back. "Nolan," she said, and her voice broke on it in a way she would have been embarrassed by, in any other moment. He turned, and even through the smoke, even with her streaming eyes and her useless nose, she knew him instantly, not by scent, not by any sense her whole life had told her mattered, but by the shape of him, the particular way he held himself, unmistakable, hers. He had rerouted enough of the ventilation control to slow the venting, but the pressure door's failing seal had trapped him in a narrowing pocket of the corridor, and the manual override panel that would let him out had jammed under the same pressure fault that had doomed the seal in the first place. "You shouldn't have come down here," he said, and there was something raw underneath the words that had nothing to do with the smoke. "You did not answer your comm." "Comm's dead, took shrapnel when the panel blew." He gestured, unhurried even now, at the jammed override. "I can get this open. I just need another set of hands on the secondary release while I hold the pressure equalizer steady, or it'll blow the whole seal and take the corridor with it." She was beside him before he finished the sentence, hands finding the release mechanism he indicated, and for the several minutes it took them to work the door free together. Him calling instructions in the same patient, unhurried voice he used for every malfunctioning system, her following them with a precision born of 2 months spent learning to trust exactly this kind of steady attention. Neither of them spoke of anything but the mechanism between them. When the door finally released, air stabilized, the howling seal falling silent, they stood in the settling haze for a moment simply breathing, and Tavira became aware that she was shaking, and that it had nothing to do with the smoke in her lungs. "I could not smell you," she said. "I could not hear you over the door. I have spent my entire life believing that scent was the only sense that mattered, the only sense capable of finding the people who matter, and down here, in the worst moment of my career, it gave me nothing. Nothing at all." She looked at him, eyes still streaming, voice unsteady in a way she had never once permitted it to be in a research log. "And I still found you." "How?" Nolan asked softly, and she understood he was not mocking her with her own question. He was genuinely asking, genuinely wanting to know, the way he had always genuinely wanted to know things about her that no one else had bothered to look for. "The shape of your shoulders," she said. "The particular way you hold yourself when you are solving something difficult and refusing to be afraid of it. I did not decide to memorize that. I simply did, Somewhere in the last 9 weeks, without noticing I was doing it, the same way you memorized me. She reached out. No ceremony, no careful architecture of Vulpine courtship left in her to observe, just the plain fact of her hand finding his in the settling smoke, and did not let go. I think I understand now. What you have been trying to tell me since the first week. It is not a trick of the eyes. It is what happens when you look at someone until looking becomes knowing, and knowing becomes something the body does not need scent to hold on to. The compound cleared from the lower ring's atmosphere within 6 hours, and Vulpine's scent returned to a station that had spent those hours relearning, badly and briefly, what it was like to be blind in the way humans had always quietly been assumed to be blind. Dre's official incident report, filed 3 days later, credited Tavira Sen's facial recognition methodology with the successful evacuation of 19 station personnel during the period of olfactory suppression. The first formal correlate acknowledgement that human-style visual cognition was not a deficiency to be compensated for, but a discipline in its own right, one Vulpines themselves could learn. The reunited littermates Tavira had found in the smoke asked, in the following week, whether she might teach a small workshop on what she'd done. A request that turned, over the following month, into a standing course offered through the Correlate's Emergency Response Training Division, the first formal curriculum on Meridian Coil built around the deliberate cultivation of visual memory as a survival skill rather than a human curiosity to be studied at arm's length. Tavira taught the first session herself, with Nolan seated quietly at the back of the room, and found herself explaining, to a room of skeptical Vulpine security staff, the same small anchoring details he had once explained to her, the asymmetry of a face, the particular set of shoulders, the way a person held stillness when they didn't want anyone to notice they were afraid. Rennick Fell attended the second session, arriving late, saying nothing, leaving before the questions began. He did not apologize to her, she had not expected him to. But the following week his division quietly submitted a joint research proposal to Dre's office suggesting a collaborative study on combining scent masking countermeasures with visual recognition training for station security personnel, and Tavira understood the gesture for what it was, in the careful, indirect language her own people so often used to walk back a wrong they were not prepared to name aloud. The paper that followed, co-authored by Tavira Sen and Nolan Vey and published under the Correlate's own imprint, did not use the word Tavira had privately begun to use in her own thoughts, because there was no adequately rigorous way to footnote it. It spoke instead carefully, academically of cross-modal identity recognition frameworks and attention-dependent visual memory as an underexplored bonding mechanism. Language dry enough to satisfy even the skeptical board members who had doubted her objectivity 9 weeks earlier. Dre read the final draft in silence, then looked up at Tavira across the same desk where she had once accused her of compromised judgment. "You've built an entire new subfield out of a man who looks at faces," Dre said, not unkindly. "I have built an entire new subfield," Tavira said, "out of discovering that scent was never the only way to be known. Merely the only way my species had bothered to practice." She hesitated, and then added, because Dre had earned honesty rather than diplomacy. "And out of a man who looked at me, specifically, before I understood what it meant to be looked at that way." Dre's tail moved once, something that in another Vulpine might have been the ghost of a smile. "The board approves continued funding," she said. "And Dr. Sen closed the tracking device file properly this time. I checked. It's still open." News on a station the size of Meridian Coil traveled the way scent once traveled through the lower ring before the compound had stolen it away, fast, pervasive, impossible to fully contain once it had entered the recirculated air of general conversation. By the second day after the crisis, the story of the xenosensory researcher who had walked into a burning corridor with no working nose and found her partner by nothing but the set of his shoulders had acquired the particular embellishments that station gossip always added to a true thing to make it feel worth repeating. Some versions had her finding him through solid smoke with her eyes closed. Some had Nolan trapped for hours rather than the 20-some minutes the incident logs actually recorded. One especially persistent version, which Tavira heard third-hand from a mess hall attendant who did not know she was the subject of it, insisted the two of them had been formally bonded for months and had simply kept it quiet out of professional discretion. She found, to her mild surprise, that she did not mind the exaggerations nearly as much as she would have expected to a season earlier, back when she had still been the kind of researcher who corrected imprecision on principle. There was something almost comforting in the way the story had become communal property, passed hand to hand through a station that had spent 6 frightening hours doubting whether it could trust its own most fundamental sense, and had needed, afterward, some proof that connection could survive the loss of it. Junior researchers she barely knew began stopping her in corridors to ask, half shy, half eager, whether the visual recognition techniques could really be taught to anyone, or whether it required some rare aptitude they assumed they personally lacked. Parents from the residential decks, still shaken from an evacuation in which they had briefly lost the ability to find their own children in a crowd, petitioned the Correlates Education Office to add a basic version of the training to the general station curriculum. Even the mess hall's kitchen staff, who had no professional stake in the matter at all, took to greeting Tavira by naming some small physical detail. "Good morning, the eyes give you away even across the hall," as a kind of gentle, communal joke that she found, against all her prior instincts, rather moving. Nolan bore the sudden attention with considerably less comfort than she did. He had never been a man who enjoyed being looked at, which she privately found one of the stranger ironies of the whole affair, that a man who had built his entire private discipline around looking closely at other people should find it so unsettling to be looked at closely himself. "I fixed a door," he said more than once, to colleagues who tried to thank him for the rescue as though he had done something heroic rather than merely competent. "Tavira's the one who walked into the smoke without a working nose to find me. I was just standing on the other side of a jammed panel, being extremely bad at getting myself out of trouble." "You are permitted," Tavira told him, the 4th or 5th time she overheard this particular deflection, "to accept credit for a thing you did well, Nolan. It does not diminish what I did to acknowledge what you did. I know that," he said. "I just don't love being the story. Never have." "Then let me carry the story for both of us," she said, "and you can simply continue fixing doors." It was, she thought, a fair division of labor, and one that seemed, in the weeks that followed, to suit them both. Ressa found her 3 days later, in the quiet hour after the workshop's 3rd session, waiting outside the training room with the particular careful posture of someone who has come to say something and is not entirely sure of its reception. They had not spoken at length in over a year, not out of any bitterness, only the ordinary drift of two people whose bond had softened into something more like family than romance, each following separate postings across the Correlates' scattered stations. Ressa smelled, as she always had, of home, the particular note that had once meant safe, close, mine, and that now simply meant someone who has known me a long time. "I heard about the lower ring," Ressa said. "And I heard, from 3 separate people, about the human you found in it, without your nose to guide you. His name is Nolan," Tavira said. "And yes." Ressa studied her for a long moment. Not with Nolan's particular, cataloging attention, but with the older, quieter recognition of someone who had once shared a den with her, who knew the shape of her moods the way scent had always let Vulpines know one another. "You look different," Ressa said finally. "I could not have told you why, if you'd asked me on the corridor a month ago. I would only have said you smelled the same and looked, somehow, like someone else entirely." "I do not think I am someone else," Tavira said carefully. "I think I am the same person, examined for the first time by someone willing to look closely enough to see all of it." Ressa's ears dipped, not in sorrow, but in something gentler, an old friend's version of relief. "Then I am glad of it," she said. "We were good together, Tavira, for the years we had it. But I do not think I ever looked at you the way you are describing. I do not think I knew to." She reached out and touched Tavira's arm, briefly, warmly. "I hope this human of yours knows what he has found. He tells me," Tavira said, "that he has spent his whole life looking for exactly this, without a word for what he was looking for. She held Ressa's gaze steady. I think we found the word for each other. Word of the paper reached beyond Meridian Coil faster than Dre had anticipated, and with it came the kind of attention that made even a seasoned administrator's tail go still with wariness. A formal delegation from the High Correlate itself, the central governing body that coordinated sensory security doctrine across every station in the network, arriving to review the findings in person before authorizing their inclusion in standard interspecies training. The delegation's senior representative, an elder Vulpine named Ambassador Corisvel, held the kind of old guard authority that had helped write the very security doctrines Tavira's research now quietly unsettled, and she made no secret, on arrival, of her skepticism. You are proposing, Ambassador Vel said, in the small conference room Dre had cleared for the review, that a species with what our own records have classified for 6 generations as a deficient sensory apparatus in fact possesses an entirely separate framework of identity recognition, one our own people have simply neglected to develop. Her pale eyes moved from the data slate in front of her to Tavira, then, briefly, to Nolan, seated at the edge of the table with the careful stillness of a man who understood exactly how much weight his presence carried in this particular room. Forgive me, Doctor, if I ask whether your own closeness to the human specialist has shaped your reading of otherwise ambiguous results. It was the same accusation Dre had raised weeks earlier, delivered now with the added weight of a delegation that could, with a single unfavorable report, end the funding for the entire subfield before it had properly begun. Tavira felt the old flare of defensiveness rise in her chest, and made herself set it aside, the way she had learned, over the course of the study, that calm data outlasted wounded pride in every review that mattered. Ambassador, she said, I invite you to run the trial yourself. Choose the conditions. Choose the subject pool. I will not touch the design. She glanced briefly at Nolan. And I will step out of the room, if you prefer, so that no one can accuse the trial of being shaped by anything but its results. Ambassador Vel's ears flicked, faint surprise breaking through the practiced neutrality of her expression. You would remove yourself from your own experiment. I built this research to withstand scrutiny, not to withstand my presence in the room, Tavira said. If the mechanism is real, it does not require me to prove itself. It only requires him to look, and someone honest to watch. The trial the delegation designed over the following 2 days was, in its way, more exacting than any Dre's office had devised. Multiple subjects across multiple species disguised in identical suits, randomized without Nolan's knowledge, run twice more with different Vulpine volunteers standing in Tavira's place entirely, to test whether his accuracy was specific to her or a genuine, transferable skill. He performed with somewhat less speed and certainty on the unfamiliar volunteers than he did with Tavira. A result the delegation's own statisticians noted with interest rather than suspicion, since a skill built on sustained, attentive familiarity would be expected to perform best on its most studied subject and still function, more slowly, on strangers he had only just begun to learn. Ambassador Vel reviewed the final numbers in silence for a long while, then set the slate down. I came here prepared to write a report ending your funding, Doctor, she said, with the blunt honesty of someone old enough not to soften an admission of error. I am leaving with a request instead. The High Correlate will want this training piloted on 3 additional stations within the year, under your supervision. I would ask that you consider taking a coordinating role across the network, once your current posting concludes. She rose, gathering her slate. It appears my generation built an entire security architecture on the assumption that a sense we did not use ourselves must be worthless to everyone. That was, I think, a narrower kind of blindness than the one we accused the humans of. Dre, watching from the far end of the table, allowed herself, for the first time in the entire review, something that was unmistakably a smile. She designed the final trial herself, 3 weeks after the crisis, not for Dre's board and not for the paper, but for the private, stubborn part of her that still needed, after everything, one more clean answer. Full environmental suits again, no face, no fur, no scent, the same conditions that had once seemed impossible to defeat, But this time no crowd of decoys, no observation rail, no correlate board watching. Just the two of them, alone in the same atrium where he had once found her among 200 strangers, at an hour when the station's public spaces stood empty and quiet, lanterns from some earlier festival still strung dark and unlit along the high transparent dome. She stood at the far end of the atrium in the suit, silent, and let him search. He crossed the distance without hesitation, the way he always did now, and stopped in front of her, and this time, when she pulled the visor free and the recycled air gave way to the ordinary air of the station around them, she did not ask him how. She had run that experiment enough times to trust the answer without needing it repeated. Instead, she asked the question underneath all of it, the one her grandmother's old story had left unanswered, the one no research log could hold. "Do humans have a word?" she said. "For recognizing someone when every ordinary sense has been taken away? When there is no scent, no name, no face left uncovered, nothing left for the body to read, and you still know them, instantly, without doubt?" Nolan reached out and laid his hand against the side of her face carefully, the way a person touches something they have looked at for a long time and only now been given permission to hold. "No," he said. "We don't have a word for it. I think we just borrow yours." He looked at her, really looked, the way he had looked at her from the very first week, the way that had once unsettled her and now felt like the only kind of certainty she trusted. "I think the Vulpines had it right all along. I think it's a bond." Tavira's ears lowered, slow and unguarded, in the old, vulnerable gesture her species used for nothing except the truth. "Then let it be a bond," she said. "Chosen. Not because any ceremony requires it. Not because any experiment proved it. Because I looked, and I knew, the same as you." Above them, in the dark curve of the dome, the last unlit lanterns of some earlier festival hung motionless against the stars, waiting for a light neither of them needed any more to find their way to each other. Vulpine custom did, in the end, have a ceremony for what had grown between them, though Tavira had spent so many years assuming she would never use it that she had to ask her mother, over a long-distance comm call 2 systems away, to walk her through the particulars. The choosing was an old rite, older than the correlates, older than the scent implants that had made it largely ceremonial rather than strictly necessary. A public gesture in which two people stood before their gathered community and named, aloud, without hedge or qualification, the person they intended to build a life beside. It required no legal document. It bound nothing a correlate registrar could enforce. It was, her mother reminded her over the crackling calm delay, exactly as meaningful as the two people standing inside it chose to make it, which was, Tavira thought afterward, very much the point. They held it in the same atrium, 3 weeks after the final experiment, because either of them could think of a better place than the room where they had first proven, and finally believed, that they could find each other by nothing but attention and will. Dre attended, standing near the front with the particular satisfied bearing of an administrator who had bet correctly on a difficult call. Ambassador Vell sent a formal message of congratulation from 2 stations away, along with the unexpected addition of a small ceremonial lantern from the High Correlate's own stores. "For the dome, since I understand you have a fondness for unlit ones." Rennick Fowl came, stood at the back, and left a data crystal afterward containing the full specifications of an improved scent masking compound, a gift so aggressively practical and so entirely without romantic sentiment that Tavira found it, in its own way, the most sincere apology he could have offered. Ressa stood near the front as well, beside a Vulpine researcher from the biology wing whose hand she had, Tavira noted with quiet pleasure, been quietly holding for several weeks now, the two of them clearly building some early, tentative architecture of their own. The rite itself was simple. They stood facing each other in the center of the atrium, the gathered crowd a loose circle around them, and Tavira spoke first, because tradition asked the one who had never expected to stand here to speak before the one who had always, in his own quiet way, been waiting. "I built my career on the belief that a person could be fully known through scent alone," she said, her voice carrying clearly in the hush of the atrium. and I have spent the better part of a year discovering how much of a person that belief left unexamined. Nolan Vey looked at me before he had any chemical reason to, and kept looking long after any experiment required it, and taught me, without ever intending to teach me anything, that being known is not a passive thing that happens to you through the air. It is a choice, renewed every time someone chooses to look closely enough to see you as you actually are, rather than as you present yourself to be found. She held his gaze steady, unhurried, the whole gathered station briefly unimportant around the edges of it. I choose to be looked at by him, for the rest of however long we are given. I choose to look back, with whatever senses either of us has, for as long as it takes to learn all of him, the way he has already learned all of me. Nolan's voice, when it came, was rougher than usual, and he did not try to hide it. I never had a ceremony for this back home, he said. We mostly just kept showing up, and hoped the other person noticed. But I like your way better, because it says the thing out loud, in front of everyone, instead of leaving it to be guessed at. He reached for her hands, held them the way he had once held a jammed release mechanism, careful and sure. I choose you, Tavira-sen. Not because an experiment proved I could find you in a crowd of strangers, though I'm glad it did. Because every time I look at you, I want to keep looking, and I don't think that particular want is ever going to run out. The old rite called, at its close, for no scent marking, no formal document, nothing but a single unlit lantern, held between two joined hands, lit at last from within. Nolan struck the small igniter Dre had provided, and the paper lantern between their joined hands filled with soft bioluminescent gold, and around them the gathered crowd of the station that had once assumed his species half-blind released the low, warm murmur that Vulpine custom used instead of applause, a sound like wind moving through tall grass, old, and approving and full. Tavira looked up, past the lantern's glow, into the face she had learned so completely she could have drawn it in the dark, and found him already looking back, the way he always had been, the way she now understood he always would. I knew you, she said softly, before I had a word for knowing. So did I, Nolan said. Turns out the word was always going to be yours to give me.